Hello everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Adrian Lloyd. This is just my stupid opinion. So today on the podcast, it's a variety of stories today, actually. As promised, I didn't get to talk about the ISIS brides in my last podcast, so we're going to be talking about the ISIS brides at the beginning right now. We're going to be also getting into some changes that are going to be happening in Canada, the law changes. A little while ago, California, they lowered the criminal charges for people who knowingly transmit HIV. Before, if you did it, it was a crime, because HIV is deadly. Then they lowered it. Well, now there's the debate about whether we should do that in Canada. People are saying it's unfairly targeting people in the HIV community, so we're going to be talking about that. And yeah, really, I just cannot seem to get away from Bill Morneau. No matter where I go, his name keeps popping up and more news comes up about him. It gets even more interesting than it does before. Last time we were talking about Bill Morneau, the Conservatives were grilling him for possible inside trading, and it was not looking good for him. There's been some more developments on that front. But first, we're going to start off with a very quick story. This one is more specifically aimed at any Canadians that are out there watching this. Does the name Corporal Nathan Cirillo mean anything to you? For those who can't remember, Corporal Nathan Cirillo was the soldier who was killed on October 22nd, 2014. That was when we had our own crazed gunman who gunned down Corporal Cirillo at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and then made an assault on Parliament Hill, where he was eventually gunned down himself. The attacker's name was Beep O, if I remember correctly. I can't remember his full name. But anyway, Corporal Cirillo was the one man who died on that day. This is a name that we should always honor and remember. He was a soldier who was killed in a ceremonial position. Being the guard of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, you're not really guarding anything. You have a gun, but you don't have any ammo. You're dressed up in your ceremonial garb, not your standard military fatigues. It is just a symbolic position. And he got gunned down while doing this. This is not something you'd expect to happen. He came back up in the news recently. It turns out some scumbag had been using Corporal Nathan Cirillo's picture, all his information, including his name, in order to target women in the United States and try and draw them in. As this article from CBC came out, it says, fake Facebook page using Nathan Cirillo's name, photos to catfish women online. Account shut down following unrelated complaints made by veteran group. So 4 women came forward and spoke to CBC News, where they said that the person who was posing as Nathan Cirillo had been talking to them, and they all came from the United States, different parts of the United States, and he was talking to them, trying to get nude photos or whatever else out of them. But they were unaware that this happened to be a dead man. That it was in fact somebody posing as a dead man for his own sick sexual advantage. Can a man like that not just rest in peace? Is that too much to ask? This isn't just a situation where somebody died and then somebody took their whole identity and perpetuated it. This is a man who died in the line of duty. This is a man who was gunned down for no reason whatsoever. Apparently it seemed pretty relevant to the terrorist at the time. But for the rest of us, he died as I don't want to call him a hero just for getting shot and killed where he was. But he died a martyr, if I can say, without intending to be. It allowed Canadians to rally with each other when we saw this poor young man get gunned down in the middle of the day over nothing. And then he was a well-known dog lover, and after he was killed, there was a famous photo of both his dogs poking their head out underneath their backyard fence, and they just have this sad look on their face because their owner's never coming home. He didn't go out and die in a blaze of glory. He didn't go out to have movies or poems or songs made about him. Nathan Cirillo got up that day, put on his pressed military uniform, his ceremonial garb, and stood next to his partner at the tomb of the unknown soldier, thinking it's just going to be a normal day. And then this coward Bibo comes up behind him and guns him down with, I think, 2 or 3 shots to the back. They say there's no rest for the wicked. It seems to me there's no rest for the honorable. And then on top of that, think about these poor women who thought they were probably making a connection with a guy, probably thought that they were having some fun with a guy. Then they find out they're being manipulated and used, and under disgusting terms. Once again, it's not like they just grabbed a photo offline and put it up and put a fake name in. They went out of their way to take this guy's photo, take his identity, and pose as him. I honestly, in recent memory, cannot remember such desecration of a dead soldier than this poor man, Nathan Cirillo. It's funny because I remember when everything happened on October 22nd. One thing that the news, the politicians, and the people in Canada made very clear is this is a name we cannot forget. That this poor man died for nothing. And in honor of him, we must remember his name. I always have, actually, believe it or not. I always remember the name Corporal Nathan Cirillo. But it seems most don't. And it's such a shame. What's also a shame is how many people forget that a day before that, 2 Canadian soldiers were run down by another person who was inspired by ISIS in a pickup truck who hit them. One was severely injured, the other man died. That poor man is barely remembered. It's bad because I don't even remember his name right now. I had to go look it up because I couldn't remember. It was Patrice Vincent. And Vincent was run down by a man known as Martin Rouleau, who did it in an ISIS-inspired attack. But while we're on the topic of ISIS, this article that I've wanted to talk about for the last couple episodes, but I kept getting bogged down by other issues and I didn't get a chance to talk about it, was this article out of the National Post that says ISIS brides are turning home and raising the next generation of jihadist martyrs. The plan to use women to launch the Islamic State's next incarnation involves female returnees teaching the glories of the Caliphate to their offspring. That's a little scary, isn't it? Raising the next generation and possibly doing so on our soil. When Trudeau rolled out his plan about wanting to rehabilitate ISIS fighters, I said on my episode where I spoke about it that people don't just get to leave ISIS. They don't just walk out and say, I'm done, like you quit a job, here's my 2-week notice, I'm flying back to Canada, America, Britain, France, wherever, Belgium. You don't get to do that. If you leave, there's a reason you leave, or you escape. And there have been reports of many who have escaped. I remember I think it was about a year after we had reports of European women that were running away to join ISIS and the Caliphate as a ISIS bride. These weren't Middle Eastern Muslim-born women. These were women that were born in a society, a Western society, very similar to any one of ours that we're living in at the moment, who ran away from good homes, most likely, I assume, to join this ideology. And about a year after that, there were a number that fled. And there were a number of reports about how they didn't think about it was the way it was supposed to be. You know, they heard it was a paradise. It turned out to be hell. They suffered untold tragedies. And without a doubt, I felt bad that they had to go through this. But at the same time, you can't help but feel, what did you expect? We had reports. We know what ISIS is like. We know how they were treating people. And we were already having reports about how they were treating their wives and their sex slaves. So I don't know why they went there and expected treatment that was any different. But those were the ones that fled. Some stayed because they couldn't get out. Others stayed because they did buy into the ideology. And this is very true in many publications of even ISIS has related to about interviews where they talk about mothers who say they would be completely happy and proud if their kids sacrificed themselves in the name of Allah and for the Caliphate. I don't know how you get so perverted that you buy into this shit. I honestly don't know how a mind can get twisted so far around an ideology that is so overtly about murder, rape, and slavery, and every single type of religious sin and secular unethical practices and anti-humanitarian, anti-liberal practices. It was so overt. I don't know why anybody would expect anything different. So those that stayed definitely bought in to that ideology, unless they were just so trapped they couldn't get out. But if they stayed and actually participated in the Caliphate, then they bought in heavily that ideology. And now these are exactly the type of women that they want to return to Western countries in order to raise the next generation, which is actually a pretty good idea for future soldiers, because the standard right now as we go on is that it is young Middle Eastern men between, I think, 18 and 30, maybe it's 18 and 40, that and they're single men that are usually the ones committing these sort of acts. When we look at the women and with children, we don't really perceive them as a threat. Rightfully so, they generally aren't. They usually are not a threat. They're usually just wives and mothers. So now, by sending their brides over, they can be the ones who are doing the recruiting. They can get in because nobody's going to suspect it. Especially if they say that they're fleeing from ISIS. That would be another perfect example. The worst part is about things like this, stories like this, is we have this crazy fucking group right now over here, and a large part of Islam that pertains to these crazy fucking ideas, that any moderate Muslims out there get a bad rap from this. It's such a shame. But the problem is we've seen so many attacks that have come these days. If you've been paying attention to some of the bad shit that does come, we hear of coming from Islam, which generally comes out of the Middle East, most of this bad shit. But even we're starting to hear stories from England, from America, from Canada, from France. Not even necessarily of attacks taking place or yet, but the sort of things that are being preached. Even if these are small areas, these are isolated areas where this is happening. This is the sort of ideology that doesn't match up with our society these days, because we don't agree with a lot of these things that these hardcore imams preach, that this Wahhabism preaches. Wahhabism is responsible for most of the shit that we criticize out of Islam these days. I mean, if you go back to old photos of, anywhere before their Islamic revolutions, such as Iran, women are sitting there in shorts and t-shirts and they're walking around having a good time. And now you look at it and women can't go outside without getting covered up. But if we take a look through this article, it says, she covered herself in black from head to toes to greet a recent visitor to the small Moroccan house where she stays, and removed her veil only when assured that her guest, also a woman, was alone. Over sips of mint tea, she spoke admiringly of her militant husband and the comrades she met in the Islamic State all-female brigade. Calling herself Zara, she declined to give her family name because she has traveled to Syria in secret. She vowed that her children would someday reclaim the Islamic paradise she believed was stolen from her family. Quote, we will bring up strong sons and daughters and tell them that about life in the Caliphate, she said, fingering her teacup through black gloves. Quote, even if we hadn't been able to keep it, our children will one day take it back, end quote. In recent months, women immigrants to the Islamic State have been fleeing the Caliphate by the hundreds, eventually returning to their native countries or finding sanctuaries in detention centers or refugee camps along the way. Some are young mothers with young children who say they were pressured into traveling to Iraq or Syria with their husbands. but a disturbing number appear to have embraced the group's ideology and remain committed to its goals, according to interviews with former residents of the Caliphate, as well as intelligence officers and analysts who are closely tracking the returnees. We have two sides. It seems in America these days we've got the extreme left and extreme right, mostly, or at least they're the loudest voices, and they both want complete opposite goals in almost everything, but immigration is a good one. On the extreme left, we have open borders. No borders whatsoever. Let everybody and anybody travel amongst all the countries and really get rid of borders. On the other side, strengthen the borders. Build a wall. Don't cut off immigration completely. Don't let anybody immigrate. These sort of stories actually strengthen the anti-immigration side because they can point to things like this and tell people that that's the sort of attitude they don't want in their country. And personally, I don't think you'll find many people that on the left or the right that, well, probably none on the right, and very few people on the left that'll actually agree with this and say, okay, yes, let these ISIS brides in even though this is what they want to do. I'm sure you can find a few crazy ones that want to do that. But most don't want this. How do we distinguish who they are? How do we, if they do slip through, how do we prevent them from spreading their message? It's very difficult too because they're veiled. It's very hard to know who's who when you're veiled and you're all veiled in the same way. So for any open borders people out there who say, let's just open the borders, the problem is that on the other side, the people who want to close borders completely, they can actually bring up the security issue, which is a real issue these days amongst countries all over the world. Since 2015, we've seen countless terrorist attacks across Europe. This didn't happen before. We didn't have terrorist attacks to this scale across Europe before. Of course, terrorist attacks always did happen. But this many people dead? I don't think so. I do not think so. The other problem with the open borders argument is that everybody has to view it that way, or it doesn't work. If people still see borders and people are not seeing borders, for example, if ISIS still sees borders, or whichever crazy Islamic group happens to come up in the ashes of ISIS, which I'm sure we'll hear about within the next year. And even worse than that, they all seem to get more extreme every time a new group pops up like this. We thought the Taliban was bad, Al-Qaeda turned out to be worse, and then ISIS turned out to be worse than Al-Qaeda. So whichever group we happen to hear about next, I'm sure will be much more brutal than what we heard about with ISIS. But if ISIS sees borders while America says we don't see any borders, ISIS is still going to attack you. They'll still view that landmass as America, as the West, as part of their enemy. Because don't forget, ISIS themselves have said that they're waging war across the West, and it is the fact we are not Muslims. It is the fact that we have a liberal society. It is the fact that we are incredibly sinful. They've full out stated it. This is also the problem with those other countries that happen to take in Wahhabism and other extreme Islamic ideologies, is because they also view us the same way. Let's not forget that in the Quran, it talks about what to do with the non-believers. The West is not as Christian as it used to be. For these extreme ideologies, it is acceptable. For the extreme Islamic ideologies, it is actually acceptable to live in a Muslim world and believe something else. However, you have to pay them the jizya, the tax in order to live underneath Islamic rule. And that doesn't even mean you'll get to practice your religion. You'll still be viewed as a second-class citizen. This has been laid out. This is not me just saying this. This is fact. This is how it works. But let's not forget that the West has made a big shift towards secularists, non-believers, agnostics, atheists. In terms of Islam, they cannot live under Islamic rule. Non-believers, atheists, and the like The only thing that it says inside the doctrine of Islam is that those people need to be killed. This is the difference between the Middle Eastern fundamental Islam and what, at least in my experience, in meeting with a lot of the Muslims who are, as I was put it, Americanized, the ones who have been raised here and enjoy Canada, like the country, blah blah blah. It's kind of similar to these days in the Christian faith that they don't kill a kid for talking back to them. Not that they necessarily did before. I really don't know if that's ever been taken seriously. But the point is even though it's in the rule book, they don't take it seriously. And that's how I find a lot of Anglicanized Muslims are. A few of my friends who will pertain to Islam, but they have no love for killing infidels. They have no love for extreme ideology. They don't want to go and live under Islamic rule. Whether I've just been lucky with the people I've met, and I've met good people, and I know that there are fundamental Muslims in the West these days, even before the 2015 massive migrant crisis. Maybe I've just been lucky with the Muslims I've dealt with, but personally, like I've said, Anglicanized Muslims I've dealt with don't really pertain to that extreme fundamental ideology. These ISIS brides, these ISIS fighters, these Wahhabis, and these fundamentalist Muslims from the Middle East, they do take that shit seriously. But we need to be careful because this produces fear, this produces suspicion, and the wrong people tend to get targeted by this. Just in general, this sort of story makes you feel very uneasy. To think that your neighbors could possibly be somebody that's trying to raise the next generation of jihadists, that's going to brew even more suspicion than there is today. And then we're going to see more pushback against this, against Islamophobia, which it's not properly defined. People will say Islamophobia for anything. You be critical of the doctrine of Islam, you're being Islamophobic, which is not being Islamophobic. It's being critical of a doctrine that millions, billions of people consider real, and many of them, millions of them, take very seriously. But now, even the Canadian government is talking about they want to go and the government needs to go full-blown against Islamophobia. It's kind of funny because if you look up the crime statistics, Jews are still the most targeted group in Canada, followed by the LGBT community. Those are both two groups ahead of Muslims that are targeted by hate crimes every year in Canada. And to be honest, those are also two groups that in Islam are targeted quite often. We hear plenty of stories of gay people living in Islamic worlds. It can go from awful to deadly. We hear about the way that the Jews can be treated in the Middle East. Now, don't get me wrong. If we look to Israel and Palestine, Israel's done some nasty shit too. There's no denying that. But there's no denying that the Jews have also had a lot of nasty shit done to them. It seems historically the Jews are one of the most persecuted groups, but they always get left behind. Because like I said, nobody ever talks about anti-Semitism anymore. You hear it every now and then, but it's usually slurs people throw at each other. Oh, you're anti-Semitic, that's why you shouldn't like this person. But nobody actually talks. But nobody actually goes out and talks about anti-Semitism and says, hey, did you know that there were this many Jewish temples that were defaced and vandalized last year? Did you know that there were this many hate crimes made against Jews last year? Did you know that this many anti-Semitic messages were thrown around on Twitter or whatever? We never hear about it, but we're hearing a lot about Islamophobia. The difference in these two situations is it's almost a little more understandable that people might have an irrational fear, considering what everyone has been through these days. And people who pay attention, again, can hear a lot of bad messages that are coming out in the name of Islam or that are being pushed by imams. Some don't believe that Islam can be reformed. Some don't believe that there are moderate Muslims out there. I'm not one of those people. I do believe there are moderate Muslims out there. I've met them. I also like to say that they seem to be rare, though. I seem to have been lucky and met a lot of moderate Muslims, but they seem to be rare. A lot of Muslims take their religion seriously. And I do believe Islam can be reformed. The problem is you'd have to break through this belief that it is the final word of God, because this is one of the things about the Islamic faith, is that it's said to be the final word. That puts a lot of pressure on, because if it's the final word, anything that comes after is blasphemy. It is not true. And if it's the final word, well, then making changes to the rule of Allah would be, blasphemous. So we need to break through this narrative first. So I don't believe Islam is close to being reformed. I think we need to push for a reform of Islam so there's not so much fundamentalism that's going around, especially out of the Middle East. Maybe I'm just a bit of a dreamer in that regards, but I think if the conversation keeps up, the West is aggressive in trying to point out the flaws of Islam. And then we start getting imams and other well-known figures of Islam involved in trying to push reformation. I think it is possible. Any other solution? I don't know. I really don't. Because if there's not a reformation of Islam, Islam can either, as a religion, die out in popularity, take over, or continue fighting with the West. So for Western people, there's really two options. Either kill the idea of Islam as a religion, or get Islam to reform. Because the other two options are, we can keep battling it out with our two different cultures, East versus West, or one side wins. That's the only options that I see available to us. So maybe I'm a dreamer, but I'll take the Reformation option because it seems to me to be one of the least violent ones. When I say killing Islam out, I don't mean literally killing Islam. I mean killing it in the battle of ideas, destroying it as a religion. Destroying the whole idea of Islam as the final word. That's what I mean. The same way that a lot of atheists and secularists have sort of cut down a lot of the Christian argument, you need to do the same thing to Islam. That's the only way I can see a reformation happening. So funny enough, I do not see the reformation of Islam or the real changes being held in the hands of the Christians. I actually see the real change for Islam being held in the hands of the atheists. Atheists have always been the one to push back against religion the most. Out of everybody else, out of agnostics, out of secularists, out of non-believers, atheists are the one, because those are the ones that'll go full out and say, we don't believe in God. We have a lack of faith. And because of that, you're not willing to live under the religious rule. I think this is what happened in the West, is that when the atheists are the ones that took the reins and pointed out the flaws in Christianity and actually made people look at it and say, oh shit, there's problems here. At least on an objective level, in a real world area, there's a lot of problems. That's why I believe it is the atheists that need to take the reins in fighting back against the idea. In the marketplace of ideas, they need to lead the charge against something like Islam. Because I'll tell you one thing, a lot of atheists have gone looking into other religions. While maybe they were losing faith, or maybe they started out with no faith to begin with, they go looking in other religions too to see what they say. And you start seeing the problems in all of them. You see the problems in the word of Allah, you see the problem in the word of Moses, you see the problem in the word of Jesus, and I should have said Muhammad actually for Islam. You see the problems in it. When you see the problems, you can form your argument and tear it down. This is exactly what Christopher Hitchens used to do. He used to look at the cracks or the chinks in the armor, and he used to exploit those chinks. He would just pierce in there with a knife and just keep whittling the armor open until you were completely exposed. This is what made Hitchens such a great debater. And in my opinion, in the religious argument, this is also what makes atheists such great debaters in the religious argument. So maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, maybe it'll go the way I think it does, maybe it'll go in the complete opposite direction. I really don't know in this situation. But for the time being, I'm going to stick with Reformation of Islam, because these sort of stories coming out from ISIS and other extremist groups, they really make me nervous sometimes. Even though the chances of anything happening are small, the point is, the more you allow it, the more chance it's going to happen. This is in fact the same reason I had a problem with Trudeau's rehabilitation plan for ISIS fighters, is the fact that, well, number one is that nothing like this had been tried before, and it probably was not going to work because it was more based on research than action. It seemed like, it, as I stated before, it was like a prototype psychology. It was like in the beta stages. It was in no way ready to be deployed on, active fighters who are mired deep in an ideology. And on top of that, you are just enabling the opportunity for something to happen when you're bringing back known fighters who have gone over and committed acts of genocide, war crimes, human rights violations, and religious genocide in a way, because they were also taking out Christians a lot of the time. Christians were a lot of their targets. So they were committing a form of religious genocide. This is what all these people are doing, and then when finally they get beaten, they want to come home. And we're allowing them, and they're just going to put them through some rehabilitation program. A government's job is to keep its citizens safe. And actually, a very liberal point of view on the government is that the government's only job is to give opportunity to the citizens in order to do whatever they want, while keeping them safe from foreign threats and from threats to each other. That's pretty much one of the most pure liberal principles on the government. The government is not keeping us safe from foreign threats. When you are going to import citizens, and sometimes not even citizens, but people, immigrants who moved to Canada and then moved back in order to fight for Syria, if you're going to import citizens and previous immigrants who are known murderers and brutalizers, then you are not keeping us safe. But I think I've said all I can say on this subject, so it seems to me, in an act to not look like the West is racist, we are actually sacrificing a huge amount of security. And I'm not one to give up freedoms for security mostly, but you gotta have at least a small amount of security, especially from an active threat such as people coming in and trying to corrupt your youth. Alright, we're gonna move on to our next article. And I may have spoken a little bit too soon in the intro when I said that there was a law going to be passed on this. But essentially, as I stated before, California recently changed their law that anybody who's been infected with HIV, if they don't disclose that they have HIV and they infect someone else, it used to be a crime, but after the law changed, they diminished it. And instead of it being a criminal charge, it's seen as a public health issue. So now Canada's thinking about this. Because as it says on CTV News, changes needed on HIV non-disclosure, but not necessarily new law. Study. They stated this on World AIDS Day, December 1st. What the shit are you doing? So as this article goes on to say, it says, Ontario will no longer criminally prosecute HIV-positive people who don't disclose their status to sexual partners if there is no realistic possibility of transmission, the province announced on Friday as it marked World AIDS Day. Great timing, guys. Great timing. The move comes as the federal government published a study saying that the bar for someone who doesn't disclose their HIV status to be charged with criminal offenses needs to catch up with science. The Justice Department study pulled together scientific evidence and the current prevalence of HIV in Canada and treatment and stacked it up against the way the criminal justice system currently handles cases of people who don't disclose their HIV status prior to engaging in sexual activity. While there's no law specifically related to it in the criminal code, non-disclosure can lead to assault or sexual assault charges because it's been found to invalidate a partner's consent. Because it's been found to invalidate a partner's consent. Current wisdom suggests that if they knew a person had HIV, they wouldn't consent to sexual activity because of the risk of transmission. Of course. See, these days HIV is not the threat it used to be. When it first came out, it was killing millions of people left, right, and center. People were dropping like flies. We started to get a handle on it. Thank you, Magic Johnson. Although, fuck you for holding out on the cure for so long. Anyway, so it's not as much of a threat, and it can be contained through drugs, and that also means that the risk of transmission is low. In my opinion, any form of sexually transmitted disease, deadly or not, that you don't tell a partner about and you transmit is a valid invalidation of consent because your partner doesn't know that you have it and then you're transmitting it to them. You know you got it. So essentially they're saying that they want to lower it because it's unfair for HIV people because people are less likely to have sex. The reason that we have this law in place is, well, it's pretty simple actually. See, when the scare came out and everybody was dying, people realized that there is going to be a group of people that won't tell their partners that they're having, that they have a HIV, especially at that time, because it was much more deadly. So this was put in place to prevent them from spreading it without it knowing, because it was literally killing millions of people. Even though we've got a handle on it now, what we need to realize is even if it's not the deadly disease it used to be, it is still a life-altering disease. It is still the type of disease that you will need medication for the rest of your life for, so there's some money spent, as well as just whatever side effects will come from the medication, from the disease itself. I don't know, because I don't think I've ever met anybody with HIV. Maybe I have and they just haven't told me. And to do something like that is really fucking sneaky. Now, that being said, HIV can be spread not just sexually. You can spread it, yes, through sex, the most common way, but there's also sharing needles, as an example, is a good way to spread diseases. And even last time I talked about this, when California changed the law around, I even spoke about how there is a group out there that are called bug chasers or bug catchers. I can never remember the proper term. It's either bug chasers or bug catchers. And the whole point is that they go out and they spread disease around. Now, mostly as far as I know, it's usually restricted to the community. However, there's without a doubt a group of people that will get their sexual thrill from spreading it with people that don't know that they have a sexual disease and that they're spreading it to them. Yes, it is a medical public health issue without a doubt, but the reason that our laws are so strong where it's considered a criminal charge was put in place for good reason. And now really they're just saying that because these people with HIV cannot get laid, they need to change the law around. This seems to be a common trend I find with the Liberal government, is that they're doing a preference of the minority over the majority. This was put forward during the gender pronoun issue, Bill C-16. This was put forward during M-103, which was the Islamophobia bill, and this is being put forward right now. Because there is a small percent of the population that has HIV. The majority of the population does not. But now we're going to put the majority in a more dangerous position in order to cater to the minority, the HIV community in this case. I have a sneaking suspicion that cases of HIV are going to skyrocket once this happens. Well, again, it's not a law that is being put in place, but they're saying changes need to be made. One complaint in support of changing the rules around is the fact that, number one, is that the law is not enforced unanimously across the country. It varies depending where you go. The other reason is that some don't have the access necessary in order to handle their HIV. Well, I find this is an appeal to emotion because, of course, you're saying, oh, these poor people, they can't get access to the services they need. If you think about it, that means they're actually more dangerous. If they're not getting their medication, if they're not keeping their virus in check, then these are the people that are more prone to spread it around. These are the people where it's really going to impact their lives. So I really don't think that just because you change the rules in that if you transmit it without telling your partner, that's going to make a difference on gaining access to services. Why don't you just instead offer more money to help combat HIV or sexually transmitted diseases instead? Just saying that they don't have access to the services doesn't really further their side of the argument. But any way I really look at it, I don't see how we can justify lowering the criminal charges, because the charge has to do with not telling your partner that you have the disease. It's not that you tell them they consent and then you get charged anyway for spreading it around or having sex with them when you have the disease. This is literally saying you did not receive consent in order to possibly spread your disease around. I mean, here we are, we're railing against plenty of men for behavior that is next to nothing, you know? Guys these days are being told things like holding the door is sexist. Yet here we are trying to defend people not consenting to transmit a disease. Because at least in my mind, when I'm thinking about this, I always picture a guy transmitting the disease to a woman rather than the other way around. While it will happen that way, I guess that's just my stereotype in my mind. So I guess coming from that point of view, I don't see how this is assisting women. This seems like this is just going to be detrimental to them. Although, once again, that is the point of view I've taken. There's going to be plenty of situations where it is the complete opposite, and it will be women spreading it to men. But either way, it's just an anti-human thing to do. It's unethical. At any other point during sex, if you don't get consent, it's considered rape. Yet, when you don't get consent before having sex with someone, unprotected sex, where you could spread your disease, it's not considered rape? How does that make sense? I thought this would be considered a form of sexual assault or rape, which it is considered right now, but they want to lower it, and it makes sense. Somebody didn't consent to a sexual act. Even if they consented to the actual sexual act itself, they didn't consent to knowing and willing having sex with an HIV positive person. My other problem with this is another example of something that gives more fuel to conservatives and right-wingers when they want to talk about how some liberal ideas are bad and how they push dangerous narratives. Here we go. We have a liberal government that's pretty much supporting taking down the charge. We're almost at that point where they're looking to lower the legal requirements about consenting to HIV positive sex. And that's just dangerous, and that's going to be looked at as a liberal idea. As I've said before, some have toyed with the idea about pedophilia, about how it should be acceptable. This will then be in turn viewed as a liberal idea, despite the fact it's not. The whole idea of liberalism is to give every single individual the freedom to make their own choice, freedom to carve their own path in life. This was the whole philosophy behind John Locke and his liberalism when it was founded. But inside of this doctrine of freedom and unrestricted freedom, there was also the fact that freedom was still limited to not being able to impose on other people, not being able to harm other people. In both situations, like the pedophilia example and this example here, the sexually transmitted disease example, that is imposing on other people. That is an illiberal idea. This is causing harm to somebody else. This is another problem if we want to go back to the gender debate. It's an illiberal thing to do because it's telling you you need to call these people by their preferred pronouns. It's not that they want to do it and they're asking you politely, say, would you please call me by my pronoun? They're saying you have to call people by their pronoun. It's illiberal. And it seems that liberalism is being abandoned more and more these days. They're just, even though everyone's willing to call themselves a liberal, they just use it as a term to say left wing. Because, in fact, if you look into what liberalism is supposed to be about, these are not the narratives that they push. Liberalism is about equality, but it's also about freedom. And the one fundamental thing about liberalism is equality is not supposed to trump freedom. Because you can have freedom, you can have equality in a free society, but you can't have freedom in an equal society. And I feel really bad because last time I quoted that on the podcast, I couldn't remember who it was, and I ended up, in the subtitles, I ended up saying I thought it may have been Milton. I was way off, and I feel a little bit ashamed. It was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I should have known that. I've read the book. So I'm a little ashamed about that, but that is where that quote came from, which a few podcasts ago I could not remember. So what's next on the agenda? What's the next thing that's going to be pushed? What's the next thing that we have rules and laws and restrictions in place for a good reason that we're going to push the boundaries on? I'm not going to lie. I am waiting for an argument that somebody out there is going to make about how necrophilia should be acceptable because the person is dead and you're not hurting anybody. I'm waiting for it. I'm really waiting for something like that being pushed. I'm not sure about if it's necessarily going to be that example, but it's going to be something. Some other boundary that we've set in place as humans that we're willing to push. And that too will be considered a liberal idea. Once again, dragging the term liberal through the mud. There are some bad liberal ideas out there. I'll be the first one to admit it. I mean, I've gone on my tangents about the welfare state and how I used to support it, and these days I've changed completely, done a 180 on the welfare state. I don't support it at all anymore. So I'll admit there is some bad liberals ideas out there. However, a lot of the ideals that conservatives hold on to these days are true liberal ideas. Freedom of speech is a classic liberal idea. General liberty. Liberal. Liberty. Where do you think it came from? And technically, even though liberalism it's not supposed to protect religion, it's supposed to give people their choice on religion. So going against religion is not necessarily an anti-liberal thing to do, an illiberal thing to do. But if you're going to then try and force somebody to follow a certain religion or not being able to practice a certain religion, then that is too a illiberal idea. And that was why when Bill C-89, I believe it was, in Ontario, I think it was Bill C-89, it was a rearrangement of the Ontario Human Rights Code, and in that they ended up taking out, the Liberal government ended up taking out religion as something to be protected and ended up putting in gender preferences. Taking religion as a protective status is a illiberal thing to do. Whatever your opinions on religion is, even if you think it's something that should be completely done away with, like right now, we should do away with a religion right now. If you really are a liberal, then you never would actually try and act on that because it's not the right way to go. That's why the right way for a liberal is to battle it out in the marketplace of ideas. Not many people who call themselves liberals are willing to do that these days. And that's why I find that it's starting to be liberalism is really a dwindling thing. But very few people are willing to really look at the philosophy and follow the philosophy that was set down by people like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and many others. The American Constitution, there's a good example of classic liberalism at work. It's almost completely a liberal document. It's almost like John Locke himself was the one who penned the American Constitution. He might as well have just put his name at the bottom of the Bill of Rights. So whenever the American Republican Party is trying to look towards the Constitution, trying to uphold the Constitution, they really are making a move to liberal philosophy in order to defend it. But in my opinion, liberals for the most part seem to have lost their way and have just given in to a bunch of different philosophies and ideologies that they shouldn't. So it's been a bad few months for Bill Morneau. Like I've said before, every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in. Last time we were talking about Bill Morneau, we were discussing about how he may have possibly been doing insider trading, that there were shares sold right before his tax change was put in place on December 7th, 2015, I believe it was, if my memory serves me correct. And the stock market took a drop. But $10 million worth of shares were sold in Morneau Shepell, which is Morneau's company that deals with retirement pensions. So all throughout the week, Bill Morneau has been under fire by all the conservatives, but mostly by the conservative finance critic Pierre Poilievre, who's really been going at him about this. And it's gotten to the point where Bill Morneau has gotten raging mad in the House of Commons over these accusations, and he's also threatened legal action against Pierre Poilievre if he was to suggest insider trading again. He even tried to convince Pierre Poilievre to go out and go outside and say that to the media, because inside of Parliament, the MPs are not subject to the same libel and slander laws as when they are in public. So if he had gone out and said this, then Bill Morneau could have properly sued him and taken him to court for whichever one. I think libel is the one that's spoken. No, slander is the one that's spoken, I'm pretty sure. I can't remember. All I know is with slander and libel, one is defamation and when you're speaking it, and the other is defamation when you're writing it. Well, anyway, it came out in a recent Global News article that Bill Morneau's father sold $200,000 in shares in the family company days before the tax changes were announced. So once again, this is not looking good for Bill Morneau. When we were talking about him last time, I ended up saying that even if Bill Morneau didn't sell the shares directly, the fact that so many of those shares were sold beforehand would show some form of insider trading. Because even if it wasn't him making the sell, he would have been one of the most directly related person to this company from the government. So he would be the prime suspect in telling people whether what he was going to introduce and whether the stock market was going to drop and whether to get their money in or out. So that put a spotlight on Bill Morneau, and now this one about his father selling the shares just puts another one on, even if there was some possibility before that it wasn't Bill Morneau doing insider trading and it was somebody else in contact with someone at Morneau and Shepell. Let's just say pretty much all that possibility is gone once the person who made a large sale right before is your father. Bill Morneau's narrative about him just being naive and not knowing the proper way to conduct himself as an MP and a business owner, and how he's really innocent in the whole matter, and how the conservatives are making up conspiracy theory, really doesn't hold much merit anymore. This is conspiracy fact, not conspiracy theory, because those shares were sold. And they were sold by somebody inside Morneau Shepell. And considering how your fucking name is on the company, who is really the prime suspect? I know this is almost word for word what I ended up saying, I think, last episode. I know I always make reference to what I said in last episode or this episode. It's just, I'm so lonely here. So as this article goes on to say, it says, regulatory findings show that William F. Morneau Sr. sold 100,000 shares of Morneau Shepell Inc. at a price of $15.20 per share on November 23rd, 2015, and sold another 100,000 shares on December 3rd, 2015 at the price of $15 a share. On December 7th, 2015, Morneau, the finance minister, tabled documents in the House of Commons which announced his government's intention to change tax rules that would increase taxes on wealthy Canadians as of January 1st, 2016. According to historical share price data published by Yahoo Finance, Morneau Shepell Inc. shares dropped from $14.90 a share on market open of the morning of December 7th to $14.09 a week later on the morning of December 14th. That represents a drop in value of just over 5.4%. Boy, really getting out a good time, aren't you, the Morneau Sr., eh? Now, none of this is proven. It is still possible that this really was just coincidence. His father just happened to sell his shares in the company right before this was legislated, because Bill Morneau said he had no contact with his father about the tax changes or about selling shares for Shepell and Morneau. I'm not saying we should take his word for it, just that it is a possibility. But considering the evidence that we've been racking up over these last couple of months, I don't really think that's a likely possibility. I think we really are dealing with dirty deals right now. I find myself hesitant to believe that it's all naivete on Bill Morneau's part. Maybe for a bit, but you've been in office for 2 years now, and by now you figure you got a handle on how things go in Parliament and how the government runs and what's expected. And there are certain things that are just kind of always been seen as a problem. And one of them is when you have personal interest invested in something, when you're trying to pass a law in Parliament or any government, really. Let's take an example of what happened a few years ago where General Motors was on the verge of collapse and bankruptcy and the government bailed them out. If somebody that was tabling legislation in order to bail out General Motors had held shares inside of General Motors stock, or had, in Bill Morneau's case, if he had been related to the founder of the company and had an active role inside the company for some time and then left to go into government while still holding investments inside that company, then it's going to look like they're trying to do it in their own self-interest. And this is a similar situation because Bill Morneau his company deals with retirement pensions. If you make these changes, that means that these middle-class Canadians are going to have to start taking their own pensions seriously. And la-di-da, there's Morneau and Shepell there, right there with a consultant, ready to talk to you about your pension. Another thing that should be pretty obvious to people that are going into politics, like trying to get an active role in government, especially if you're a business owner or a stock investor, is you don't do what Bill Morneau did. And as this article says, it says Morneau is the only minister still holding assets outside of a blind trust, the Ethics Commissioner says. Mary Dawson clarified earlier statements, says Justice Minister previously held assets without blind trust. A blind trust is pretty common for when you're going into public office, and what it does is you hand over essentially all your rights to those shares for your time in office, and a third party, an independent party, takes them, they manage them, they invest them the way that they want. You have no say, you have no knowledge of how your assets are being managed. This is pretty common for people that go into politics. This is something Bill Morneau did not do. In fact, they said that there was only one other minister, aside for Bill Morneau, who didn't have their assets in a blind trust. But Bill Morneau is the only Liberal that didn't have his assets in a blind trust. And the other one, as it stated in the byline, it was who didn't have their assets in blind trust, was Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould. So that was the other one who didn't have their assets in a blind trust. But considering what's going on around Bill Morneau right now and what he wanted to do with the tax change, this is a much bigger issue than our Justice Minister not having assets in a blind trust. We'll come back to that another day, maybe. I think by now it's been proven that this isn't Bill Morneau being naive. Naive is where you make mistakes because you're innocent. You don't know how things work yet. By now, it's starting to just look like it's something else altogether, like he's willfully trying to hide something. Now, the one thing I've noticed while following this for sure is that while I've been reading this, the National Post has been all over Bill Morneau's dick during this whole thing. And what I mean is that they have been so defensive of the minister. It's been ridiculous. While CBC has been seemed to have a little more of both. I've seen some articles that were more, again, they're all op-eds. But you see some people that are in support of Bill Morneau saying there's nothing there, and then you got others that are saying you fucked up big, Bill Morneau. But National Post takes the one stance on this. The reason I use the National Post so much when I'm podcasting is because I actually get my news from a website called littlereport.com. And what it is they've formatted their... it's formatted the same way that Drudge Report is, with a bunch of hyperlinks clicking to different news articles. But unlike Drudge Report, they don't have an obvious bias. I gotta admit, the first time I ever got on a Drudge Report, I actually kind of was like, well, what do you mean this is a far right-wing news source? You got ABC, NBC, blah, 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 all the way down, and all these different news sources, but you go on there a little bit, and you just realize it pushes the same subject, especially if you're paying attention to other sort of media outlets. It just pushes the same sort of articles in defense of Trump. But the Little Report just seemed to borrow the format of Drudge Report and just link to a bunch of different articles. In fact, I would say there mostly seem to be left-wing articles. I'm getting Global News, I'm getting CBC, I'm getting National Post. I actually usually don't get a Toronto Sun or Vancouver Sun or the more conservative articles. Usually I have to go looking for those ones if I want to try and get the other point of view. So that's where I get mine, and they've linked to National Post a lot of the time. But yeah, National Post has been very defensive of Bill Morneau and the Liberals since they've come into power back in 2015. So I usually try not to rely on National Post as a sole form of political news. So it seems like the walls are beginning to close in for Bill Morneau, actually. Every single time he tries to deflect and he tries to suggest there's nothing, something new pops up that doesn't look good for him. But I get the feeling like we may be starting to hammer the final nail into the coffin for Bill Morneau. It's gotten to the point where the Conservatives are calling for him to step down. And even though this is something that is said a lot of times about the Conservatives, that they're always calling for ministers to step down, it actually does not happen historically as much as people claim. It only happens in very few circumstances. Then I want to end off today talking about Michael Flynn. During the Mueller investigation that's been going on into President Trump, we finally hear that Michael Flynn has pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. He pled guilty to one account of lying to the FBI. Just one, actually. I was a little surprised to hear that. But what became the big news out of this wasn't the guilty plea itself, and it wasn't even the fact that that Michael Flynn has said he's going to work with Mueller and giving him information on other people on the Trump campaign. He said this because he felt abandoned by Trump and his administration during the final days of this whole going on, to the point where he's had to sell his house. So things are not going well for Michael Flynn, and he looks like he's ready to testify. But what became the big controversy, the big news, was a very big fuck-up that ABC News did. And what they ended up doing is, when they were doing a live report on this situation about how Michael Flynn had surrendered, how he pled guilty, he's flipping, he's working with us, we're going to find something out about other ones. What they claimed, big mistake, is that Michael Flynn was told by Trump during the campaign to contact Russia. So yeah, contact Russia. Sounds pretty bad, except ABC was then later on in the day forced to issue a correction because it turned out that's not what happened. While Michael Flynn was told by Trump to make contact with the Russians, this was during the transition period. Trump had already won the election, and he was saying that it was a transition period between when he was going to become president and when Barack Obama was stepping down. Considering how this investigation has been put forward for collusion with the Russians in rigging the U.S. election campaign, this wouldn't show the collusion that Mueller's been investigating for over a year. In fact, I've heard that making contact with foreign powers like this during a transition period is actually quite common. This is what you're supposed to do. But what Flynn did lie about is apparently a Russian representative met at Trump's home in Mar-a-Lago, and he lied to the FBI about this. However, this took place once again during transition period after the election. So even though he did lie, he absolutely lied about Trump not making any connection with the Russians. Considering how this is supposed to be in regards to rigging the election, the fact that everything takes place doesn't suggest collusion. It's another disappointing turn in this case because just a month ago, maybe a month and a half, we had Paul Manafort that looked like he was going to get indicted, and then it turns out it was for tax evasion. It had nothing to do with anything that took place on the campaign. That was the first arrest, or the first indictments laid, I should say, and it was quite disappointing. Now we have another person, and we can't even point towards indictment. All we can point towards contact with Russia, but we don't have collusion of the election being stolen. This is why I've been losing faith in this investigation the longer it's gone on, because we don't hear anything for so long, months on end. There's practically no news, and then suddenly something just pops up, and then it turns out to be nothing. So I guess, again, we'll have to see what sort of information Michael Flynn's going to give up. But for Christ's sake, this is not what we are expecting. This is not even remotely close to the type of evidence that we were promised, the type of results that we were promised. Everyone was screaming from a mountaintop after the election about how it was rigged, it was Russia. And then after a year of investigation, we have nothing. We've got bubkiss. So I'll be interested to see what sort of information that Michael Flynn will put forward to Mueller to see if there's any collusion, but I haven't seen it. And I was a guy that early on in my podcast did my own investigation into it, and I was actually, after that investigation, disappointed. I was not seeing what everyone else was claiming. However, I saw how associates of his seemed to have close connection to Russia, but that seems to have turned out to be nothing in relation to the election. So here in Canada, we've got one person already in office that we're chasing after, trying to pin insider trading charges against. And then down in the States, we're having a huge investigation into somebody who is the current leader of their country, and we are turning up nothing. So one person needs to be charged and not getting charged. The other person they're trying to charge, and we can't find anything. Interesting political world we live in at the moment. As George Carlin once said, he says, when you're born in America, when you're born into this world, you get ticket to the freak show. And when you're born in America, you get front row seats. Well, we're living in Canada. We are one row behind having all the same shit thrown at us. It's just hitting us a little bit later. I want to thank you all for joining me on the podcast today. I'm Adrian Lloyd. This is just my stupid opinion, and I'll see you guys soon.